Hi, I'm Ryan from ratings.com. Today we'll be doing a review of the Samsung Odyssey G5 S27AG50. We'll be evaluating it on our standardized test bench to see how it performs and if you should buy it. This monitor is the successor to last year's Odyssey G5 LC27G55T, though they have very little in common. The LC27G55T is a curved 144Hz VA monitor, while this year's S27AG50 is a flat 165Hz IPS display. So check the full product name to make sure you're getting the monitor you're looking for. The G5 S27 is a mid-range 1440p display with good gaming performance, which we'll talk about in the review. This year's G5 shares the same design languages as the rest of Samsung's Odyssey lineup, with a textured back and blue plastic ring around the connection to the stand. Unlike on the G7 and G9, there is no RGB bias lighting on the G5. The stand doesn't support the monitor very well, as the screen wobbles quite a bit. There's also a small rubber clip for some very basic cable management, which is a slight step up from last year's model. It can also rotate clockwise into portrait mode. If you prefer not to use the stand, then it does support a standard VESA 100x100 mount. There's a pretty standard range of inputs with 1 HDMI ports and a DisplayPort. However, the DisplayPort only has a bandwidth of DP 1.2. This means that at the max refresh rate, you'll be limited to an 8-bit color depth. If you want to get 10-bit color depth, you'll be limited to 120 Hz. Now, let's take a look at the tests. We'll start with the contrast. A high contrast ratio is important if you use the monitor in the dark for deep dark scenes. Unlike last year's model, the Odyssey G5 S27AG50 has an IPS panel with mediocre contrast. Local dimming is a feature that controls the brightness of individual zones of the backlight. This allows for much deeper dark scenes in things like video games, as the area of dark objects can be further darkened. As a result, the overall contrast can be boosted. The 2021 G5 does not have a local dimming feature to help improve the contrast. Now, a high peak brightness is important either in a bright room to counteract glare, or if you want brighter highlights and a more impactful image, especially in high dynamic range or HDR games. This monitor has great brightness in SDR, getting more than bright enough to overcome glare in almost any room setup. The HDR brightness is only marginally brighter than the SDR brightness and is only okay. It doesn't get bright enough to really make highlights pop in HDR. Also important for a bright room is good reflection handling. The Odyssey G5 has a hazy screen coating that helps to diffuse reflections and reduce their intensity. Overall, bright rooms shouldn't be an issue at all. A potential downside of a hazy coating is if it causes small details like text to appear grainy. Text clarity is also impacted by a bunch of factors though, like the subpixel arrangement. Overall, it's good, as you can see in these images. The screen coating doesn't have much of an impact. The top photo is with Windows ClearType, which helps diagonal lines look more clear. Without ClearType in the bottom image, it's alright but does lack some subpixel detail. Good viewing angles are important to ensure details at the far sides of the screen don't look washed out. Surprisingly, for an IPS panel, the G5 has only okay viewing angles both horizontally and vertically. This shouldn't be much of an issue unless you often need to share your screen with others or plan on mounting the screen significantly above eye level. An overall uniform screen brightness and color is important when playing video games, to avoid distracting areas that are overly dark or bright. This does vary between units, but we expect this G5 we bought to be about typical. The overall screen has a very similar brightness, which is great and shouldn't be an issue. The black uniformity on our unit is mediocre. There's backlight bleed in the bottom left corner and clouding throughout. This does change from unit to unit quite a bit, so keep in mind that yours could be better or worse than ours. Accuracy in the standard sRGB color space is important, as it's the standard for computer use. The color accuracy on this monitor out of the box is bad. White balance is significantly off, and most colors are noticeably inaccurate. There is a dedicated sRGB mode, but its accuracy is even worse and far too cold. Calibrating the monitor might be necessary for you for color accurate work. If you want to take full advantage of this monitor and display vivid colors in things like high dynamic range or HDR games, then the G5 S27 is not the best choice. The SDR color gamut is good, but its HDR color gamut is lacking. There's virtually no benefit to viewing HDR content on this monitor because of the narrow gamut, okay brightness, and mediocre contrast. A high refresh rate is important for gaming. It allows the image to be drawn on the screen faster, which makes it more responsive. And if the monitor supports variable refresh rates, then you can get a smooth experience without tearing, regardless of the changing frame rate. This year's G5 has a 165Hz refresh rate, which is higher than last year's 144Hz refresh rate. This monitor also supports FreeSync and G-Sync with AMD and NVIDIA graphics cards across the whole refresh rate range. Do note that over HDMI, you'll be limited to a 144Hz refresh rate. When playing video games, a fast response time is important for the clearest image without distracting blur. The Odyssey G5 has excellent response times at its max refresh rate. Unfortunately, enabling the adaptive sync feature locks you out of the overdrive settings, but thankfully it behaves almost exactly like the standard setting, which has quick response times and no overshoot at all. The faster and extreme settings have far too much overshoot, so we don't recommend them. If the frame rate drops while you're gaming, then luckily the response time is still great. With adaptive sync on, they still behave like the standard settings, so there's no need to worry about adjusting the overdrive between games. If you really want the clearest image when playing fast-paced games, then black frame insertion or backlight strobing features are useful to reduce the blur caused by the persistence of the image during a full frame. The 2021 Odyssey G5 can flicker the backlight between 120Hz and 165Hz depending on your input signal, which is great for the clearest image. You can still enable it at lower frame rates, but the flicker frequency doesn't go any lower, so you may see duplication of moving objects. You also can't use black frame insertion when adaptive sync is enabled, so you do need to make the trade-off between extra clarity and responsiveness when changing frame rates. The BFI feature on this model isn't the most effective at making the image clearer, as you can see in the moving logo image. Now, a low input lag is really important for a responsive feel when playing video games, and unsurprisingly this monitor is excellent due to the 165Hz refresh rate. There's a setting on the monitor to adjust the refresh rate between 60, 120, and 165 Hz, so just make sure this setting is the same as your PC and you won't have any issues. So, this brings us to the main question. Should you buy this monitor? Well, firstly, it's certainly a good gaming monitor. It has excellent response times and input lag, as well as good brightness and SDR. It's not the best pick for HDR games because of the rather narrow HDR gamut, mediocre contrast, and only okay brightness. Overall, it's not a bad monitor, but there's a lot of competition in the mid-range 1440p IPS gaming monitor space. The most direct competitor to this one would be the Gigabyte M27Q. It's the same size, with the same resolution, and nearly the same refresh rate. They have very similar specs overall, but the M27Q has similar brightness and SDR, similar response times, better viewing angles, and has a much wider color gamut. It basically matches the G5 in every category except for ergonomics. The M27Q also tends to be less expensive and has a USB-C port and built-in KVM switch if you use the same setup for gaming and office work. The only downside to keep in mind for the M27Q is that it has a BGR subpixel layout, which can cause some minor text clarity issues. If you want to learn more about it, check out our video on the M27Q. On the other hand, if you're considering the Odyssey lineup because of last year's VA offerings for better picture quality in the dark, then I would still consider the Dell S2722 DGM for a mid-range option with similar specs. Alternatively, if you're looking for a high-end gaming experience, then last year's Odyssey G5 LC27G55T is hard to compete with for a high-end gaming VA.